What is up, everybody? I'm NoLucksGiven here with your afternoon snap, and today we have got an OTA balance update bringing some nerfs to cards that I have played a ton with here on this channel, plus a handful of buffs to some forgotten favorites, and we'll get to all of that in just a moment. But first, we're going to talk about Doom 2099 because this is a little bit of a weird one. Doom 2099 itself is getting a buff with an additional point of power, though the Doom bots are all getting -1 power, which will overall result in less total power that this card is able to put on the board. But I think there's some interesting things with this additional power that Doom 2099 itself is going to get that I wanted to talk about from my experiences playing with and potentially against Doom 2099. I'm going to read through the notes here in the OTA. First, Doom has been a top performing card since release, often among our strongest cards on individual win rate. What has convinced us to make this change has been Doom's strength as a single card addition to a number of otherwise unrelated decks like Scream. It was the best card in Scream last week, which is a clear indicator that this card is too impactful, and Doom's own power couldn't really just get tuned down, because then you could play it on turn 3 off of a Ravona, which would actually just make the card way more powerful. So the only way that they could reasonably nerf it while not changing it too much was making it a 4/3 and then dropping 1 power off of the Doom bots that it creates. One interesting thing about this change is we kind of knew it was coming. In the previous OTA, the Portuguese patch notes had this nerf to Doom 2099, and mostly there were some additional notes in that patch that also brought up the US agent nerf being a reason to also keep an eye on Doom 2099, and that was definitely a card that kept this card at bay a little bit. One thing that I do think is interesting on top of that is they initially were planning on nerfing Doom 2099 to a 4/4 while taking 1 power away from the Doom bot. Since then, they have decided to only make Doom 2099 a 4/3, which is certainly a more impactful nerf, and that extra power, both in the 2 to 3 and then also 3 to 4, can have some big impacts. The first one that comes to mind for me as an RSM enjoyer is that if on turn 2 you play an Iron Patriot, typically Doom 2099 is not the strongest 4-cost card to follow that up with, because you'll wind up, with the old version of Doom 2099, when Iron Patriot calculates your power there, you'll only have 5 power at the location, which is pretty beatable for 3 energy from your opponent. Now with Doom 2099 being a 4/3, that's going to give you 6 power, which I think is a notable breakpoint. That's going to go up over the top of Lady Sif and a number of other 3 power cards, 3 energy cards that having 6 energy, you just quite won't be able to battle against an Iron Patriot with, which is good news, I think, for RSM Doom 2099 players. It also means that on the final turn of the game, if you wind up playing a Doom 2099 and nothing else, not that that's typically a super powerful play, but that'll be a play that doesn't really cost you anything, I think, and that is an interesting angle. But I think the 2 most interesting parts about giving Doom 2099 itself an additional power is that it now potentially allows you to dodge some tech that previously impacted Doom 2099. The biggest one being Lady Deathstrike. Maybe that's not the biggest one, but I think that's the most relevant, is that now if you play a Doom 2099 on turn 4, getting an additional Doom bot that turn will put it up to 4 power, and then on turn 5, your opponent won't be able to Lady Deathstrike it. Lady Deathstrike is not the most popular, most powerful card, but it was something that people were playing temporarily to deal with Doom 2099. Saw it a little bit in RSM decks too. It does kind of mean that you could play Doom 2099 and then Lady Deathstrike that same location yourself and not have to worry about killing your own Doom, which that's pretty cool. I think the most relevant impact of this, though, is going to be that Doom 2099 can now more reliably dodge Red Guardian, which I think is absolutely huge. Red Guardian being one of the most played cards and always targeting the lowest power opposing card. Just one more power. Like, when I play Doom 2099, I am thinking about two things typically in terms of where I want to play the card. The first thing I'm thinking about is, could this location potentially get filled? And then, do I want to try to leave some room for Dr. Doom as a big play on the final turn? But I will often ignore that and instead play Doom 2099 into something like Savage Land, where sure, I could wind up accidentally filling that location if one of my Doom bots lands into Savage Land. You've got 2 Raptors, Doom, and then a bot, and you won't be able to add additional power there, but it completely allows you to dodge Red Guardian. And with an additional power on Doom 2099, you're just going to have an additional flexibility in terms of allowing you to dodge Red Guardian with this card, and that could potentially make it a buff. I know it is like kind of a weird nerf buffing a card, and I think with just some of that weirdness, there are going to be points that this version of Doom 2099 is able to win that the previous 4.2 version was not able to survive. Another favorite on this channel is Wiccan, which is also receiving a nerf, a little bit more of a straightforward nerf, and I won't say that this is like, oh, a buff if your opponent tries to Shang-Chi and you've strapped a Penny Parker onto it or something like that. This one's just a nerf. They're taking a power off Wiccan, and good on them. I think a card that just is bigger than the thing, but then also has an upside that is worth building around is like kind of ridiculous. And a 4/6 Wiccan definitely feels a little bit more in line. And honestly, I think it's still going to be a ridiculously powerful card. Losing a point of power makes a lot of sense. Still going to be sweet. Interestingly, in reading the notes that they have here for Wiccan, talking about Wiccan can go into a variety of different decks, and there's a lot of even like types of Wiccan shells, and I think that that makes the card really interesting and dynamic and fun, and it's almost like a good problem to have when the card can be played in a variety of different ways, as opposed to the next card that we're going to look at. Wiccan is not just like there's one Wiccan deck. There's maybe there's a variety of different Wiccan decks and different flavors of Wiccan in a way that I feel is really cool. But at some point, if every deck is a Wiccan deck, then that kind of just means that the card is too good and all you're really getting are different flavors of Wiccan. So it's interesting that, like, yeah, while a card can be good for the metagame if it inspires a variety of different playstyles and different decks even, can also be bad if it's just the best rate thing to do, which I think Wiccan could potentially still remain that. One thing that is always interesting to me is when I'm playing RSM against Wiccan or Wiccan against RSM, suddenly the Wiccan player has more energy than the RSM player, and potentially more control over the cards that they get to play in their deck. So I think that that is definitely, it's just a powerful card, and I think it's going to continue to be that. The last card receiving a nerf in this OTA is Surtur, which is also getting a buff. Similar to Doom 2099, Surtur is getting an additional point of power, but now its ability can only be triggered twice in one game, which is kind of awkward to read. It's a little bit inelegant, I think, coming from like a Magic the Gathering background to have a limitation like that on a card. Kind of reminds me of Nadu, right? But this card, I think, is what they're doing. They are slightly raising the floor by giving it an additional point of power, but dramatically lowering the ceiling for the high roll potential that this can have. Initially, I was thinking, what if they just made it like an ongoing ability, and it said like if you have 2 other 10 power cards in play, Surtur has 10 power as well. And I thought that was potentially a little bit more elegant until I realized you could just play Surtur on the final turn, potentially alongside a Scar still, and then it's better than it previously was. It would just be a lot more flexible, despite being slightly lower in power level overall. And I think that's probably not where you want to go if you're trying to nerf the card. That would just be a little bit too much of a flat power level, where it's basically just always going to be a 310, which I think is kind of the problem with this card. They want it to be a 310 while not also being a 310. And I think we're going to see a better version of that in the future with a data mined card that we just saw in the most recent patch update. Maybe I will do, I think I am going to do soon, like a look at some data mined cards and stuff like that. That's something that I've typically avoided on this channel. I dipped my toes into it with my previous video, not realizing that everything was going to be invalidated the same day, which is why I've avoided patch or data mined videos in the past. But I think I will take a look at some upcoming Marvel Snap content soon, so subscribe and stay tuned if you're interested in some of my thoughts on some upcoming content. But for right now, for Surtur, I think that this card is a really tough thing to balance because they want it to be a 310, which is just ridiculously powerful. Like, regardless of how you split it, sure, you've got to build around it. You open yourself up to Shang-Chi potentially, and this also can get Shadow Kinged and stuff, but still, a 310 is just really, really powerful. And then on top of that, you're using that to grab a free Scar for the final turn. I think that it's good that they lowered the ceiling of allowing this to be a 316 in many games, where you play a 10 power card on turns 4 and 5, and then Scar plus an additional 10 power card on the final turn, allowing this to get 4 activations. Now it's only going to get 2 activations, so definitely a little bit more reined in, but I still think that Surtur is going to be a dominating piece of the metagame and a strong card for the decks that build around it. Reading the notes here for Surtur has some really interesting insight that Surtur-based decks have the best win rate and best cube rate and one of the highest play rates in the game, which is really, really crazy numbers, and yeah, means that this is definitely something that I think is still going to continue to be a little bit out of line. Personally, they really want to keep this card's ability to activate or give you a cheaper Scar. And I think, honestly, they might just have to do away with that. I think that that's probably, I mean, you can manage that angle of the deck by playing like Mobius or something. I think that this is still potentially going to be a little bit scary, but they are also giving us a buff that could help us tackle Surtur decks. And that buff is coming to Scorpion, which is a really cool call here from Second Dinner. And I've actually started to see a little bit of Scorpion on the Infinite ladder, because it is a really good tech card against Surtur. Making their 10 power cards into 9 power cards means that they are not going to trigger the Surtur or discount the Scar. And as the OTA notes, trying to come up with other ways to interact with the deck like Shang-Chi or Shadow King are difficult because you've got to battle through Armor and Cosmo, and potentially battle through those things with priority on the final turn alongside the Scar can make it a little bit difficult. But Scorpion can just totally shut their deck down, which is really cool. Scorpion as a 2/2 has seen some play. It was a 3/3 when Marvel Snap released, and then I believe it was buffed as a 2/2 and did see some play in kind of like good stuff decks, I would call them. They were like Leech Leader decks where you played a bunch of on reveal cards, though you weren't necessarily playing for on reveal synergies. Sometimes you were, but for the most part, you were just playing it because it's like a 2/5, 2/6, depending on how many of the cards that it afflicts that your opponent still winds up playing after that. So the value of Scorpion is interesting, and when playing Scorpion against Surtur Scar, it's going to be difficult to sense its impact. It's kind of like a
Iceman in that way, in that when Iceman is really good, you've got no clue. Or Morbius, when Mobius is really good, you don't necessarily get an idea of that impact unless like you've seen them discard their swarms already or something. But getting ahead of myself, Scorpion will have a similar impact on that deck because you might not know that you hit a bunch of their 10 power cards. They could just as easily have a bunch of like armors and cosmos in their hand that they don't really care about the power of, and then they just rip 10s off the top. And you might also shrink like their Scar, which they won't care about because 0-9 Scar is still ridiculous as long as they can play it for free because you haven't afflicted their other cards. And also, if they find like favorable locations, I'm thinking, is it Xandar that just gives all cards there +1 power, or Nidavellir, then Scorpioning them isn't going to have as huge of an impact, but I do still think this is a really cool buff here from Second Dinner, and something that I think would be a lot of fun to play. I think that it might just push Thaddeus Thunderbolt completely out, because if you are playing Surtur Scar and you think it's the best deck, you might want to play a card that is also good against Surtur Scar, which probably just means that Scorpion is the 2-drop of choice to play in the mirror matches as well. And I think it could also see some play in other good stuff decks. I'm thinking Wiccan decks potentially as a 2-cost card. 1 additional power on Scorpion could give you an additional incentive to play it, and it's fine. Like RSM needs 2-cost cards, so I think that it could be fine in that deck as well, and it probably is a card that people should have been playing this past week, but with an additional power on it, I think more people will find it, and yeah, it's good. I think that there is a little bit of a difficulty, like why did Scorpion fall out of favor? If it's been a 2/2 and never got nerfed, some of the cards around it got nerfed. The thing is, a lot of Marvel Snap now is like such synergistic packages. Is Move Bounce going to want to play Scorpion? Probably not, but maybe. You could maybe cut the Iron Patriot from Move Bounce and slot in a Scorpion if Surtur Scar is really just everywhere and you want a dedicated tech card for it. I think that, yeah, this could certainly be fine, but it is a little bit tricky for the proactive decks to give up some of their, like, you're trying to play cards that I'm thinking like Colleen Wing out of discard. Colleen Wing winds up being like a 2/10 sometimes because, well, let's say it winds up discarding Swarm and then you can discard your Swarm to Bullseye later on. Well, then Colleen Wing was just like a 2/14 or something for you. So Scorpion isn't going to be able to compete with the build around 2-cost cards, but in a lot of decks, I think they will be able to find a home for it, and with an additional power, I think we'll find a little bit more decks, potentially in the Surtur Scar decks, I think, but just overall, definitely a cool card to get a buff. We are also seeing a buff to Sunspot back up to 1 power, back up to its release text, and I remember feeling when the game was early on that Sunspot was way too good as a 1/1. It basically just outclassed all other 1-cost cards because 1-cost cards were a little bit weaker back then, and it just very quickly grew out of range of all of the other options. I do think it's a little bit interesting because Sunspot's use is probably mostly now going to be defined with other cards that care about having unspent energy. I'm thinking like She-Hulk, and I'm thinking about the high Evo cards. Otherwise, and then I guess Bruce Banner, but that card's horrible. Sunspot, I think, is still mostly going to be relegated to those strategies because there's another big difference between right now and when Sunspot first came out. And that is that decks are just so much more cohesive now. I talked about decks being synergistic. Sunspot was just kind of like a good stuff card as well. But it also, like, Sunspot's great if you have a deck that doesn't mind not playing anything on turn 2. You go turn 1 Sunspot, turn 2 you miss, and now you've got a 1-3, which is a fine rate, totally. However, where Sunspot's bad is, well, one, in a potential Sanctum Showdown mode where it is really, really important to use all of your energy every turn, especially earlier on in the game. And also just in general, like Iron Patriot, that's a card you really want to be playing on 2, and then you want to be spending all of your energy on turn 3 as well. And I think that that's just like the way that Marvel Snap has moved, is we are seeing cards that, or just decks where you need to be spending all of your energy every turn to be competing. And it's part of the reason that Thaddeus Ross is also just not really a relevant card. I think that Sunspot can certainly earn its power back now. I think we've come a long way from a 1/1 Sunspot just being the best 1-cost card in the game. So I'm curious to see where this goes. I probably won't play too much of it myself because I really like Wiccan, though I do think, I mean, just maybe like 1 more power. People have brought it up in the past in Arishem decks, because Arishem decks sometimes have extra power, especially if they are on a Doom 2099 curve. Then at the very least you have 1 extra energy on the final turn. So now at this point Sunspot's a 1/2, and it's not that much harder to get a pretty good rate out of this card. Because the numbers, like for just a 1-cost card, for just that little investment, could make it useful if you're playing a not synergy based deck that isn't just trying to go over the top and do something crazy. When Wiccan came out, I did try something with Sunspot where you'd go like turn 1 Sunspot, and then it was turn 2, you could either play Psylocke or Zabu. This was back when Zabu was a 2-cost card. Turn 3 Wiccan, and then turn 4 Odin or Arnim Zola your Wiccan, so that you just have a bunch of extra energy. And then turn 5 you can play the other of Odin or Arnim Zola, whichever one you didn't, and then just to get a huge Sunspot. And then I guess the plan was like Living Tribunal it or something, or maybe use Arnim Zola to get a 2nd Sunspot. It was definitely more on the silly side. It's been a while since Sunspot, I think, has been like competitive outside of high evolutionary decks, and I think that's really where it's going to stay. I do also have some fond memories of doing silly things with Sunspot when Project Pegasus was the featured location. I've got a fun video on that that's definitely worth checking out, but you can re-trigger Project Pegasus with Legion and with Snowguard Bear form. And you can just get to a place where actually the ideal curve is you use, like, you get out Sunspot and then you Legion Project Pegasus whenever that shows up, and then you like Absorbing Man and Arnim Zola and Odin, the Legions, and all of those other on reveal effects. You just loop those a bunch of times, which allows you to just get like over 100 energy. And if you have a Sunspot and your opponent doesn't, then well, you at least win 1 location. Again, that was a Living Tribunal deck, I believe, but that could be a lot of fun. It's not really, I think, in the scope of what most players are looking at. We might have just missed Project Pegasus as a featured location, and I didn't retry that deck because I didn't think of it. But maybe now with Sunspot having an extra energy, it will inspire some other sweet ideas. Sera also getting an additional point of power is another throwback. Retro Week continues, as they say in the OTA notes here. One of the scariest cards in Snap during the early days, for sure. This card got a nerf very quickly down to 4 power, and it is a very, very good card. It is also, I think, like, not great for the game when Sera is good, at least. So I will say this is an interesting buff in that it's also kind of potentially a nerf for some of the decks that like Sera, and those decks are just trying to use Sera to play to toss priority and then play a bunch of tech cards on the final turn of the game, which there's metagames where that's good and where that's bad. Certainly against like Move Bounce, delaying your priority was pretty good. Against Surtur Scar, if they just have the armor / Cosmo shenanigans, it's not really going to get you anywhere. So different metagames, Sera has been better and worse. And I think that where Sera gets better with the additional power is in the Silver Surfer decks that actually care about the amount of power that they're putting out there with it, and that seems sweet. There are also some plans like you can use Luna Snow or Wave. Kind of you can use Electro, but not really, to get out Sera one turn earlier. Those could also be interesting strategies where you're not deliberately trying to toss priority with Sera as a 5/4, where that extra power might actually hurt those decks. But I think that for the most part, you can still play around it. You just play Sera to the, with those decks, you just are going to win one location going into the final turn, and you just make sure you've lost the other two. Interestingly, Scorpion having an additional power like Scorpion could be a good card in those decks too, because it was just it was a card that didn't put much power onto the board where you still impacted your opponent's plays. Basically, if you want to play a strategy like that, just play your Sera and your Scorpion and whatever other card you play into the same location. And then you'll win that location, probably lose the other two if you're playing them to locations where your opponent isn't, and it shouldn't really be that much of a nerf and should ultimately wind up being the buff that it is. Adam Warlock is the final card to talk about for this OTA, and they actually wrote a lot of words on it, so let's just read through those first. Adam Warlock, I guess first and foremost, is going from a 5/5 to a 2/0, back to a 2/0, but now if you are not winning the location at the end of each turn and you don't draw a card, it gets +1 power, which I think is really cool and really interesting. We've written about Adam Warlock in other forums, and we're comfortable describing the card as a learning experience. At 2/0 with the current ability, Adam Warlock was among the worst cards in the game, and on some weeks, the actual worst. We thought that made it a good candidate to experiment with stat changes, and while we did see some improvements in the card's performance, small ones, the trade wasn't worth the frustration it caused people who were enjoying the previous card. Adam Warlock in something like RSM was fine, but it still wasn't anything I was jumping at the bit to play ultimately, and I don't think there were any other decks that really tried to pick this up either with any of the cards I just mentioned to cheat out in earlier Sera, like Wave, Luna Snow, Electro. None of those were really seeing any play. There were just better things you could do with 5 energy. We did consider reworking the card. Our caution around a full rework was we would rerun the risk of further alienating original Adam enjoyers, and B, it's hard to make new cards. We prefer to focus on seasonal content, leading Adam to often get triaged in playtesting or even pickpocketed, meaning they designed something for Adam Warlock and then they just decided to put that design on a brand new card instead. And I think that is definitely an interesting thing to consider. They could have just changed this Adam to be let's say Frigga got released as something. Let's say Adam Warlock just got reworked and got the Frigga text. That would be cool. Adam Warlock would certainly be good, but then you'd be left with people that enjoyed the original Adam Warlock saying, oh, well, now we just are never going to get that card again because we have this new Adam Warlock and they're not going to reprint that old bad ability on a new card. So it kind of makes sense. And I think that this new version is actually pretty cool. There are some other words here. Pickpocketed. We decided to return to the well and look at how we could make something closer to the existing card, but improve the gameplay. We actually started with a version of the card that just always gained power, rewarding a draw once per game, but as fate would have it, we came back around to almost exactly where we started, with just a power in the fail cases. As stated above, lessons learned. And I think that this new version of the card seems really cool for a number of reasons. One is that, you can a lot less opportunity cost in only spending 2 energy on it. Maybe opportunity cost isn't exactly the correct term there, just less cost, point blank. And there is some opportunity cost in putting 0 power on the board though, but now less so with its ability to grow. I think that there is something really interesting that we're potentially going to hear the devs talk on more with the release of Sanctum Showdown. And basically, so we just got Iron Patriot as the season pass card last season, which really cares about if you're winning that location at the end of the next turn. And here we have another effect, if you're winning this location at the end of the turn. Basically, these effects get more interesting the more of them that you have in the game. If you have a game with both Kiln and Asgard, on turn 4 you've got to make a really important decision. Do you battle for Asgard and try to get those additional 2 cards, or do you try to take over the Kiln before it closes? And that presents a really interesting tension to the game, and adding in more effects that players care about like this with Iron Patriot and Adam Warlock, in addition to just that being the defining point of the Sanctum Showdown mode, I think is going to make this really interesting. And Adam Warlock can kind of provide, I mean, it makes your opponent then really have to consider about battling there, because now if they win the location, but if they only win it by a little bit, then you might be able to take over the location next turn with the additional power from Adam Warlock, or do they want to give up a card? And all of that's really interesting. I think the most powerful thing about this, though, is just the fact that if you play it into a location where your opponent has nothing on turn 2, and then they still have nothing there at the end of the turn, then you're going to lose this turn, have +1 power there next turn, and then you are winning on the next turn, which I think is really cool and potentially pretty powerful. If you just play it against your opponent's shield, Captain Shield, whatever that token is called, then Adam will get an additional power and tie it, or against anything else where they just have 1 power. But if you play Adam in a location where your opponent is currently tied with you, I think that's where it's going to have a lot of its power shine, and seems like a pretty cool thing to a pretty cool new like mini game to have to care about. So I'm excited by this one. It does mean that, like, okay, this is no longer a Cerebro 0 card, because that could totally mess up your Cerebro 0. I don't think that's like a real thing that people really have to care about, but maybe it is now a Ravonna card. Maybe it will go in Ravonna and Thena's. Maybe now, when Adam Warlock first came out, we did not have US Agent. We did not have Bast since this card has switched to a 5/5. I mean, maybe we had Bast, but we certainly did not have a deck that it could get played in so easily. And maybe Adam Warlock could just find a home into that sort of Thena, did I say Agent Venom? I might have called it US Agent, but Agent Venom deck that, that could be pretty sweet. For today, I'm going to call it there. I will have some stuff upcoming on some future content as well, though, because there was a lot to talk about in the data mines. But for today, that's going to be it for me. Thank you guys very much for watching. I'm NoLucksGiven. Peace.